Hi, everybody. Um, I'm Congressman Tom Malinowski of the U.S. House of Representatives, and wanted to welcome you all to this hearing of the Free World Commission to examine how democracies around the world can cooperate to meet the challenges posed by China. And I'm going to be stepping in as a co-chair of this meeting for my dear friend Elliot Engel, the chairman of our House Foreign Affairs Committee, who will be joining us with a video a little bit later in the session, along with Senator Risch, the chairman of our Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I'm very happy to be sharing the co-chair duties with Tom Tugendhat, Member of Parliament, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in the United Kingdom. We have a very, very distinguished panel, and I think the theme is an important one and very timely given, certainly for those of us in the United States, the opportunity that we have to look forward to a new presidential administration coming in January. I think just to frame the discussion, I think our expectation here is that the new Biden administration is not going to be going back to the old China policy pursued by the Obama-Bush previous administrations that focused more on high-level engagement and summitry and efforts to obtain Chinese cooperation on a number of issues. But at the same time, I don't think that the new team is going to make the mistake of the Trump administration of pursuing a more competitive strategy alone, going alone against Beijing while at the same time turning away America's democratic allies, waging a trade war against Beijing while simultaneously waging trade wars against Australia and South Korea and Canada and the European Union, pulling away from military alliances in Asia and Europe. I think there is a broad recognition that if we are in a contest with the Chinese Communist Party, as I think I certainly believe we are, a contest of ideas and ideals, that is one, it's a contest we can only wage and win in partnership with our allies. And there are many, many potential areas for cooperation. Just this week in the U.S. House of Representatives, for example, we passed legislation that I championed offering easier asylum, refugee access to the United States for people in Hong Kong who may feel the need to flee the Chinese government's crackdown there. Obviously, that is a burden that the United States can and shouldn't bear alone. The United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, others have extended similar offers. That's an area where we hope that we can coordinate. Efforts in the United Nations to counter Chinese malign influence. Obviously, the trade issue, South China Sea, and even areas like climate change, where I think traditionally we have focused on a more collaborative approach, seeking voluntary Chinese commitments. I think there is room, I would argue, for the United States and its democratic allies to lead an effort to set new global norms for stewardship of the planet and to challenge and even shame the Chinese government to go along. So long as we can stick together and plan this together, I think we can be quite effective. So with that in mind, I wanted to ask Tom Tugendhat if he had any opening remarks he wanted to offer, and then we'll go to Mr. Gershman and Mr. Kemp.
Well, good afternoon from here in the UK. It's a huge pleasure to join you. And thank you, Tom, for those introductory remarks. You're absolutely right. This is a joint enterprise, and we need to make sure we're working together, because the challenge that we're facing today from China is unlike many, or indeed any challenge that we've faced before, contrary to the challenge we faced, the systems challenge we faced with the Soviets in the last major confrontation between ours and another system. This time they have not only the money, but also the industrial ability to challenge on a global scale. And that's indeed what we're seeing. But we're seeing, as you know, this challenge to the 70 years rule-based order effectively made us all prosperous and peaceful. And many countries around the world achieved the same over the last few decades. The challenge is that this is not simply about our prosperity and our peace, but actually about human rights and about global standards around the world. We're seeing, as you don't need me to go into the detail of, the mass abuse, possibly even amounting to genocide in places like Xinjiang. We're seeing the repression of democracy movements in Hong Kong. We're seeing the oppression of Tibet and in Mongolia, different minorities there. We're seeing a very different internal China, but we're also seeing a very different external China. We're seeing Beijing through debt and through industrial leverage trying to change the way other countries live their lives. We're seeing a new form of pressure exerted around the world. And the Chinese Communist Party has changed in the last 5 or so years, maybe 10 years. And we're seeing a very different way in which this is working. So this is really a moment for us all to work together. We've spoken in the past individually and together with different members of this panel and different people who are speaking today about the need to work together. And some have spoken about the D-10 as an alliance of democracies. Others have spoken about a larger construct, because we need to make sure that what we're doing is we're standing together with traditional partners like the United States and Australia, of course, but also with partners who are engaged in the same struggle for the rule of law and for democracy around the world. Countries like South Korea and Japan, Taiwan and India, to name but a few. Now, this is why this session this afternoon really matters, because trying to make sure that we all focus on similar areas and are aligned, saying the same things and reinforcing each other to make sure that we take the right decisions, whether it's standing up to tech dumping like with Huawei, or whether it's responding to the use of slave labor in production techniques, as we're seeing in other areas. This is about working together. And so, Tom, it's a pleasure to follow you and to agree with your comments today. And I'm sure we're going to hear many other interesting perspectives. So I'm looking forward very much to hearing from our witnesses and from our fellow representatives from around the world. And with that, I shall leave it to you.
Thank you so much, Tom. And with that, I wanted to turn to Carl Gershman to offer any opening remarks that you might have, Carl. Carl is, of course, the president of RNED, the National Endowment for Democracy here in Washington. Over to you, Carl.
Thanks very much, Tom. And I really want to thank the Atlantic Council for organizing this very timely hearing of the aptly named Free World Commission. The Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski reminded us 3 decades ago at a conference we had in Washington, when the Cold War between the free world and communism was coming to an end, that freedom will always be threatened. And so it is again today, not only by China, but by China above all. We need to take advantage of this rare moment of potential democratic renewal to shape a common approach to address this problem. As difficult as it will be to meet the challenge posed by the Communist Party of China, I think we can do so with confidence, because the Chinese leadership's over-centralization of power at home and overreach abroad is already creating unintended consequences that will likely grow more acute over time. This is what Min Jinping explained last week in his important Lipset lecture to the National Endowment for Democracy. For now, it is essential that the D10 democracies and other like-minded countries and non-governmental organizations operate with a renewed sense of purpose and unity. Authoritarian interests and values inform Beijing's engagement with the world, and it is unapologetic about this. given the extraordinary stakes involved, it stands to reason that the United States and its democratic friends should be at least as clear and purposeful in defending our own democratic values. And may our deliberations today and the work that will follow advance this very, very vital goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl. And let me now turn to our host, in effect today, Mr. Fred Kempe, who is the president and CEO of the Atlantic Council. Fred, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chairman Malinowski and Tugendhat, and Carl, thank you so much as well. I'm pleased to join you today at the second convening of the Free World Commission. We launched this earlier this year at the Munich Security Conference, and I'm delighted that Boris Ruga, Ambassador Boris Ruga, the Vice Chairman of the Munich Security Conference, is with us today. This commission serves as a high-profile commission of lawmakers from the U.S. Congress and other leading democracies to unite the democratic world based on shared values and common interests in advancing the rules-based international order. We're extremely grateful for the support of the National Endowment of Democracy and for Carl's personal interest and enthusiasm for this initiative. This wouldn't be possible without Ned's and without Carl's continued support, and we hope to continue the close collaboration as we deepen our work and expand our range of activities at a time where this can make an even bigger difference than we thought in the beginning. This effort is part of the Atlantic Council's Democratic Order Initiative, and that's a body of work that focuses on the need to review American leadership and strengthen cooperation among democracies to advance a rules-based international order. When we think about the front end of that order, and after World War II, we had 50% of global GDP. We now have 24% or so. That means you have to be much more of a partner with your partners rather than just a leader of your partners. You really need to partner together and be even more astute in how you work with allies and partners than ever before to achieve the right ends for global democracies. The Council serves as a secretariat for the D-10 Strategy Forum, a construct that started here at the Atlantic Council among policy planners from these governments, and now has garnered an unprecedented level of attention among senior policymakers, particularly, but not only in the UK, as well as international media. Some are even talking as the D10 perhaps as being either, not, if not the venue, then a helpful way of thinking about the summit of democracies that the Biden administration would like to hold in its first year, where you need enough democracies in the room for credibility. But if all the world democracies are there in the first round, you may have difficulty reaching meaningful outcomes. A key goal of the D10 is to bridge the transatlantic and trans-Pacific by bringing allies and partners together and using our collective strengths and abilities to address the global challenges. In our view, for the reasons I cited, the Commission can play an even more significant role this time. President-elect Biden has emphasized his desire to restore democratic alliances and leadership in the world based on shared values. In this spirit, the Commission is useful not just in bringing together a network of legislators from democracies, but even more importantly, to begin to build habits of cooperation and try to synchronize where it makes sense, where it can help, legislative strategies and activities to address today's challenges. Today, we've got the honor of listening or being able to listen to a distinguished group of expert witnesses to discuss the implication of China's rise and then the best mechanisms to develop a coordinated democratic strategy toward Beijing. The Scowcroft Center on Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council has played a central role in shaping our efforts to address the strategic implications of China's rise. The Scowcroft Center is spearheading a development and developing an allied strategy, and that's going to be released next week. quite comprehensive report. Additionally, the Scowcroft Center has recently launched a 3-year project that will identify key areas of convergence and divergence between the United States and our allies and partners in Europe, with the goal of developing a long-term sustainable transatlantic strategy for managing China's rise. We're honored to be joined by so many esteemed members of Congress and legislators from across the globe. Like the rest of us listening in today, I'm eager to hear the views of the panels and the legislators on how like-minded Democratic allies can develop a coordinated strategy to effectively strengthen and defend democratic capabilities and posit ourselves in regard to China's rise. So in the interest of time, let me yield the floor back to Representative Malinowski.
Thank you so much. And I think, Tom, you're going to introduce our distinguished panel at this point.
I am. Look, thank you very much, Tom. And thanks very much, Fred, for welcoming us to the Atlantic Council and for those introductory remarks. We're going to go on now with some speakers from who've got vast experience in these areas and frankly dwarf the rest of us. So I'm looking forward personally very much to hearing from them. First of all, Dr. Kurt Campbell, former Assistant Secretary of former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and now Chairman and CEO of the Asia Group. Next, we have Ms. Margaret McQuaig-Johnson, who is the former Assistant Deputy Minister of Global Affairs, Canada, and Senior Fellow at the Institute for Science, Society and Policy at the University of Ottawa. And last but definitely not least, Ambassador Boris Rüger, former Deputy Chief of Mission at the German Embassy to the United States, and now a very esteemed Vice Chairman of the world famous Munich Security Conference. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with everyone today with my friend, Congressman Malinowski, and Fred. Great to be at the Atlantic Council. And let me just commend the Commission on this extraordinarily important work. I just want to say a couple of things about the project that I think Tom very favorably articulated at the outset. I do believe President-elect Biden will look at Asia and its new challenges in a new light. And I believe you will see an America that is purposeful, that will attempt to engage in a broad strategy that involves not just dialogue with China, but with allies and friends, and multifaceted, that involves diplomacy, military dimensions, strategy, institutions, and the like. And I do believe that the D-10 has remarkable potential going forward. And I believe the most important thing that a Biden administration can begin to do is to develop a dialogue and discussion and institution that bridges Asian and European allies about the challenges of the Asia Pacific. And let me just stop here for a moment to underscore that everything that the United States has ever done of purpose in the post-war world, we have done with Asia. Everything, whether it's stand against challenges in Eastern Europe, issues in the Balkans, in the Maghreb, in the Middle East. I would say to date, discussions between the United States and Europe on Asia are still in early stages. We've had periods in the past, initial discussions. I was part of some of those, Tom as well. I think early stages would be the right way to describe it. Some distrust, some uncertainty, some questioning of purpose and approaches. I do believe some of those areas of disagreement have melted away, but I don't underestimate some of the challenges as we go forward. I do also want to underscore that the alliance systems and the structures of partnership in Europe and Asia are quite different. And the merging, the beginning of a dialogue between these two groups will take time, and it will call on certain qualities that the United States sometimes has challenges with, such as listening. And I think that set of challenges will be deep. It is also the case that several of these countries have quite different views about the best mechanisms to apply going forward. There will be deep discussions about trade. I believe trade is one of those extraordinarily difficult issues domestically in the United States. And I think there will be some differences at the outset. So I just want to underscore it's extremely important, but it will be hard and it will take time, and there will need to be thorough discussions on the way forward. And I even though it's sometimes presented as, yes, we're going to do this, it will be one of the most challenging tasks ahead of a new Biden administration going forward. I believe both sides are welcome to it, are open to it, but it will test some of the capabilities of American diplomacy. The second thing that I think will be challenging that we just need to underscore is that China is good at many things. One of the things it's particularly good at, when it sees nations forming that they perceive to be forming against them, they are able to split those assemblies or groups like a cord of wood. They've been extraordinarily effective at this. Look at what happened to the G20 after the financial crisis, how effectively Chinese interlocutors split Europe from Asia on Europe from the United States on the way forward on macroeconomic policy. So we have to be attentive to that and understand some of the challenges here. And we will only be as strong in many respects as our weakest link in terms of how we think about the way forward. And the other thing to understand, we should not foresee this grouping as somehow a containment strategy, but more a dialogue mechanism to present to Beijing different alternatives about if China is prepared to work with the Western world or, in fact, take a different course. What are the consequences therein? But we should not underestimate some of the challenges that China will pose to these forming dialogues and groups. That shouldn't dissuade us. We should just be recognize it going forward. The last thing I just want to say as we go forward is it's critical to do, but the United States has to approach this task and the discussion about promoting and defending democracy and human rights with some degree of humility. And I think we need to recognize that in many parts of the world, let me start with Asia, the region that I spend the most time working on. I've worked on Asia for about 30 years. I've experienced Asians' expressions and views of the United States during that entire period, from anger to admiration, frustration, you name it. This is the first period in the last year or two during the coronavirus and the challenges to our own democracy, where a dominant private feeling behind the scenes is pity. And there is a view in many capitals in Asia, some hope and some fear about American decline. And so one of the most important things that we will need to do is to persuade and be clear that the period of American ascendance and dynamism on the international stage is not over. We need to acknowledge that our democracy has been wounded, but we can recover from it. And that there have been many periods in the past where we have faced questions about American durability during Vietnam, at the end of the Cold War. Each time, through ingenuity and determination, we have risen from those concerns and gone forward. But we should be honest about some of those concerns that are quietly being circulated, address them, and move forward. I commend the Commission on beginning that process. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's fantastic. We're now going on to Ms. McQuaig-Johnston.
Thank you for that kind introduction and for inviting me to participate in this important hearing. I was an advocate of the D-10 concept as soon as it was proposed. Collaboration with other nations is in the genes of Canadians and our governments, and nowhere is that more needed than in dealing with China that we see today. Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, François-Philippe Champagne, has said that the China of 2020 is not the China of 2016. That's exactly right. The new, more aggressive China of Xi Jinping is not the nation with which our countries established constructive economic relations. Canada has certainly learned that in the wake of the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were detained and later charged in retaliation. And 4 other Canadians who had been charged with simple drug offenses have been given death sentences that tracked the stages of Meng's court hearings. As Minister Champagne said in the House of Commons 2 weeks ago, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are not just two Canadian citizens, they are two citizens of a liberal democracy. And many countries represented in this hearing have had the same experience of innocent citizens being detained to be used as collateral in China's geopolitical agenda. So what can liberal democracies do to prevent such actions by Beijing? First, we should not cave in to such pressure. That only invites future hostage taking, as has been seen by other governments who did accede to China's demands in order to get their citizens back, and who saw more of their citizens detained. In addition, China must see consequences for its actions. We and our allies should take collective action under our Magnitsky legislation against those officials involved in the kidnapping of our citizens and hold them personally accountable. In the case of the Michaels, the US and Canada should name the Minister of State Security and the Minister of Public Security of China, who together are responsible for the detention system in China. We may find further retaliation taken by China, especially economic retaliation, but we must be willing to persist despite that action. Nations must also reassess their engagement with China, determining where we can safely engage and where we need to insulate ourselves from Beijing's actions. In Canada, we're awaiting the government's new China framework, which I hope will provide such a reset, along with a new Indo-Pacific strategy that acts as a pivot away from China to broaden and deepen our relations with other countries in the region. Canada and our allies should work together in alignment, finding every possible occasion in international bodies to demand that China respect the rule of law, as Canada's new ambassador to the UN, Bob Rae, has done. China must be shown that the tactics it has been using are not going to work, and its own interest lies in collaborating with others, not in hostage taking. My own area of focus is China's science and technology. That is why I've been very pleased to see the D-10 initiative as a forum that can encourage the development of 5G and related technology alternatives to China's companies that are subject to their national intelligence law. In particular, there is tremendous potential for growing the 5G capacity of certain current technology companies, as well as replacing Huawei funding of university R&D with funding from other sources. I would also like to see democracies like New Zealand included in the initiative. I'll stop there, and I look forward to the questions and discussion.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Ruga, over to you.
Thank you kindly. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation today, and happy to see a number of familiar faces among the members of Parliament. And I'm also happy to note that this Free World Commission had its start at the Munich Security Conference in February of this year. I sometimes like to quote something that Benjamin Franklin said at the time of the American Revolution, which is, we must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. And I think that's a quote that captures the essence of what this commission is about, i.e. standing together so we as democracies of Europe, the Americas, and the Asia Pacific can tackle today's challenges. Turning to today's topic, unlike Kurt Campbell and Margaret McQuagan, I'm no China expert, but like so many diplomatic and think tank colleagues, China is increasingly part of my daily bread. And China featured prominently at this year's Munich Security Conference. We had Foreign Minister Wang Yi speaking, and we saw both the Trump administration represented by Secretary Esper and Secretary Pompeo, and members of the US Congress speak in very clear terms about China. For example, Speaker Pelosi made clear that the Trump administration's approach on 5G had her full support. Personally, I believe we can give some credit to the Trump administration for highlighting the challenge that China presents and for stimulating a debate, which is not to say that I agree with all aspects of how the administration went about this. Some credit is in order, but I would argue that it has been China itself and its assertiveness that has been the main driver for the reassessment that we've seen in many parts of the world. The debate in Berlin and across European capitals has evolved in a very significant way over the past 2 years. And it's interesting to see what is a paradigm shift unfolding in real time, so to speak. Across political parties in Europe, we have those who wish to stick to a familiar model of engaging with China with an emphasis on business. And now increasingly we have those who have identified China as a threat and see the need for a new approach. In Germany, it was the Confederation of Industry, BDI, rather than the government that was first out in taking a much tougher view of China's policies. That was back in 2018-19. The debate has picked up since then. And as an example of how it evolved, the Social Democratic Parliamentary Group put forward in June of last year a paper that builds on an EU paper from 2019, where China was identified simultaneously as partner, competitor, and economic rival, a trinity that has become quite familiar here in Europe. In its June paper, the Social Democratic parliamentarians wrote, and I quote, "Even if our relations with China are defined by all the three dimensions, the ones I mentioned just now, these dimensions cannot stand side by side. The competition between the two systems ultimately defines the limits of our partnership in concrete terms and influences the nature of competition with China." So you have the Social Democratic members of parliament of the Bundestag saying that the aspect of systemic rivalry and competition sets very clear limitations for what is possible in terms of cooperation with China. This past week, the EU and NATO both highlighted the necessity for a transatlantic approach on China. Many of you will have seen the report of the Reflection Group appointed by the Secretary General of NATO, and let me quote once again. It reads, among other things, "China is therefore best understood as a full spectrum systemic rival rather than a purely economic player or an only Asia-focused security actor. While China does not pose an immediate military threat to the Euro-Atlantic area on the scale of Russia, it is expanding its military reach into the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Arctic, deepening defense ties with Russia. NATO allies feel China's influence more and more in every domain." This is quite a remarkable statement. And one day after, I think, the European Commission and the External Action Service put out a paper on a new transatlantic agenda. And again, I quote, and that reads, "As open democratic societies and market economies, the EU and the US agree on the strategic challenge presented by China's growing international assertiveness, even if we don't always agree on the best way to address this. The new EU-US dialogue on China will provide a key mechanism for advancing our interests and managing our differences." I should note that both the EU and NATO emphasize the potential for cooperation and dialogue with China as well, and the need to maintain channels of communications. So if we look at Europe and the United States, certainly we can see, and also Canada, of course, that there's plenty of agreement, but I agree with Kurt Campbell that coming together and developing specific action plans will be challenging. I'm happy to talk about various aspects of cooperation later, but in the interest of sticking to this time frame, let me just say that coming together on key issues with regard to China will be challenging, but if the EU, the US, and our democratic partners across several continents stick together, they hang together, we will be able to hold our own. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed to all three of our speakers. We now have the panel section, who I know will have many things to add and may have some further questions as well for our speakers. So I'm going to call on them if I may. I'm very sorry that Sadly, Andrew Hastie will not be able to join us, nor will Katie Pirry, both of whom have been exceptional advocates for defending the free world. And so I look forward to them joining us on the next occasion, but sadly it wasn't possible this time. So I'm going to turn, if I may, to Sven Spengemann, who is a member of the Canadian Parliament and also chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, so my opposite number. It's very good to see you, Sven, and I look forward. I'm afraid, sorry, I'm afraid he couldn't make that either. Forgive me, my mistake. So I'm going to ask Lia Quattrapelle Procopio, who is a member of the Chamber of Deputies and Secretary of the House Committee on Foreign and Community Affairs in Italy. Un piacere di vederci. Please, over to you.
Buongiorno, good morning to you all. It's been very interesting to listen to the three speakers before me. Something that hasn't come up in the speeches is that of course, China is and will remain a full spectrum systemic rival. And this has become clear also to European allies and not only to the US. We were shocked 12 years ago when Barack Obama became president and announced the pivot to Asia and didn't, for the first 3 years in office, looked towards Asia and never looked towards Europe. So we learned since then to now to what extent it is our responsibility to think in a new way about China. And Boris Ruge really explained the kind of discourse and thinking that is going on throughout Europe. But at the same time, since November 2020, we entered a new phase. That is a phase of multilateralism. Once Joe Biden will be president, we will be again back in a world that will work more or less through multilateral institutions. And so the confrontation with China will have to be brought up in that environment. And there will be a few questions for all of us, which we'll have to untangle, both within the transatlantic relationship and in the European context. So I'd like the speakers that have intervened before me to give a sense of this shift with respect to a few dimensions. First dimension, and I say this because Italy in 2021 will chair the G20, is what we are discussing about debt. Debt remittances and the initiative on debt forgiveness. Of course, we can speak about debt and poverty reduction, especially with reference to Africa, if we do that in a multilateral environment. But we all know very well that in that environment, or that in that respect towards African countries, China is actually pursuing a policy that is very different from the debt forgiveness policy that we would like to pursue. They are tying some African countries in a debt spiral. So this is one of the things that we'll have to untangle in 2021 and forward. Second issue that we have to discuss in a multilateral environment with China is climate change. And of course, with Biden president, the discourse is completely changed with compared to the previous president. But we will have to make decisions, and especially within the European Union, we will have to make decisions about exporting rights and export regulation and import regulation on this respect. So it would be good to discuss on this. Third thing is technological advance. China is not what it used to be. Somebody said that China is not the China in 2016, but it's not also the China of the early 2000s. It is a country that has developed technologically many innovations. In certain respects, China is more advanced than we are. To what extent are we ready to bring this forward with respect, for example, to technology and innovation for smart cities, for artificial intelligence, and so on? Are we ready to discuss these things? Are we ready to find a transatlantic agreement on these issues, which also means a transatlantic agreement on taxation and not only on regulation? And are we ready to bring the confrontation forward with China? Thank you. And I'm ready to hear your comments.
Thank you very much. Well, it would be great if we could have some feedback on that. And perhaps I could start off by turning to you, Kurt, because you touched on quite a lot of the earlier issues that that Leah began to mention. So perhaps we can have a little bit of feedback from you. And then if either of the other two or both would like to pick up on some of those issues, I'd be very grateful.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Great discussion so far. I do want to just spend a minute, Tom, describing the change situation that we're facing in China and why that's so important. And the MP just underscored this. Clearly, China is more sophisticated. Its technological capabilities have grown immeasurably. But from my perspective, one of the most important things that's happened in China over the last several years is the rise of President Xi and what that means for decision-making in China. If you think about the world after Mao Zedong in the 70s and 80s, essentially what a succession of Chinese leaders tried to do was to create interlocking and overlapping institutions of collective leadership, so that any fundamental decision that was taken in China would have the opportunity to be discussed, viewed, dissected, and it would prevent the arrival on the scene of a leader like Mao Zedong, who would be able to take actions impetuously without appropriate discourse and discussion. As a result, before President Xi, we actually had a pretty good idea about how decisions were taken in China, about the process they went through with leading groups, ministries, party mechanisms. But essentially what President Xi has done over the last 6 or 7 years is unprecedented. Not only has he taken China in much more assertive directions in situations in Wolf War diplomacy in Europe and taking on countries that, frankly, surprising in terms of their own interests, Australia, going across the border, the disputed areas in India, just all at once in a manner that's completely alien to the way China used to do diplomacy, in which they would try to secure certain areas and then take on one country at a time. Now they're frankly operating on many fronts. But what President Xi has done is essentially completely disassembled collective leadership to a point where every major decision in China is taken by President Xi, every decision, with sometimes an informal group of people that have almost no association or interaction with the West. And so our ability to engage in their government is often limited to people who really have very little role or activity in the formulation or execution of strategy and policy. And it presents us with enormous challenges, and we need to recognize that as we go forward. It is a situation where we've returned, just as China has grown and developed, it has returned to a system of government and a manner of decision-making that is more akin to Mao Zedong than to Jiang Zemin. In terms of the general point about how the United States, Asia, and European countries need to tackle these problems, we've discussed this a little bit. I think the initial process, frankly, would be a discussion about what kind of end states, what kinds of things, processes that we believe make sense. What are we looking for with respect to engagement in Asia? What kinds of institutions would serve our purposes? What kinds of discussions? What we are finding in Asia is that most of the institutions that have been built, like the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, others have remarkably shallow roots. And that is in contrast in Europe that have deep roots, the EU and the like. And in fact, Asians have chosen generally to avoid those kinds of deeper roots for a whole host of reasons, including worries about sacrificing sovereignty. So as we go forward, one of the great challenges will be, are Asian friends, even democracies, prepared for the deep kinds of engagements that will be necessary to form the kinds of informal alliances that will be required to engage constructively in a dialogue and present a kind of face to China about why it should avoid certain kinds of activities that are antithetical to the maintenance of peace and stability.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to build on there. Maybe I could ask Margaret if she would like to talk about some of those institutional connections, because of course, one of the things that Canada has been instrumental in doing is building up a new institutional Asian, well actually Pacific support network, which of course is the CPTPP. And perhaps you could touch on how you feel that others can join you in reinforcing that controlling mechanism.
Yes, and thank you for that. In fact, that's going to be a very important forum going forward for Canada as we pivot away from the more aggressive China that we're seeing and broaden and deepen our relations with other countries in the region. So that's the CPTPP is a model, I think, for trade relationships going forward. I also want to talk about the technology dimension, because China likes to present itself as a technology juggernaut or innovation juggernaut, and it's really not. It is now 14th on the Global Innovation Index, not even in the top 5 or 10. And while it has been going up quickly in the last 5 years, it stayed at 14th between last year and this year. So it's leveling off. In discrete areas, it is developing strengths such as artificial intelligence, but it's doing so through joint ventures, with which are Chinese majority joint ventures with Western countries, as well as through mergers and acquisitions with companies around the world. And so it's really subsuming technology from other jurisdictions. One of the things Canada is now very concerned about is China's policy for the integration of military and civilian technology development, because we have in our government labs and in our university labs a lot of very strong research relationships with civilian scientists and engineers. But we have to be aware that those are often being partnered with military scientists and engineers. And in fact, the Chinese military has a right to access any research in any Chinese lab, be it in universities or in a private company, and they can subsume these products and technologies. On areas like climate change, we can partner safely, although I've got some concern about doing that in the Arctic, because in December last year, China announced that it would be building military infrastructure in the Arctic. One can see ports that would take their ships and submarines, so we have to be concerned about that as well. This is part of the Polar Silk Road, where the military will be supporting China's commercial ventures in shipping, as well as their resource exploitation, which is starting to ramp up in the Arctic.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, Mike Gallagher, you're on the call, I believe, and it'd be great to hear your views and any questions. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you to my good friend Tom Malinowski as well for co-chairing this great hearing. I think what we're addressing today, how democracies can better work together to counter malign CCP influence via a proactive multilateral D-10 approach, is in a lot of ways the most important question in the US-China competition. And in recent years, along with many of our allies, we've made great progress to play defense, through things like banning Huawei, restricting problematic research, strengthening export controls. You'll see a lot of these things reflected in the National Defense Authorization Act that just passed the House by a veto-proof majority last night. But good defense only goes so far. I think we need to make proactive investments to ensure that the free world, not the CCP, comes to dominate the technology of the future. And with that in mind, I think the coming months represent a real opportunity to help operationalize the D-10. I think like-minded nations are going to have to work together to produce and distribute COVID-19 vaccines. It's going to take unprecedented global cooperation. And we'll need to ensure the vaccine is available on our terms, free from the kind of strings attached the CCP might like to place on vaccine distribution. So my question for the panel is really how we can use this COVID vaccine moment to build in some of the muscle memory and maybe get some of the processes in place that might lead to broader allied tech policy cooperation down the road. How can we be purposeful in ensuring cooperation today leads to better integration across our industrial strategies tomorrow, if that makes sense?
Perhaps Ambassador Ruga, I could ask you to pick up on that, because it certainly builds into the cooperation that we've looked at in the past, and in which Europe has certainly played some role and looks likely to play a more active role following the comments that we've heard from Chancellor Merkel and indeed from the opposite number for a few of us here, Norbert Röttgen.
Happy, Tom. It also ties in, I think, with the question on tech that Lia Quartapelle asked. And you will find in the EU paper, and I put a link into the chat to both the EU and NATO papers I referenced, you'll find quite a long section, in this case, on EU-US cooperation on technology. And obviously that's a key field of competition because the development of these new technologies, as we all know, are a huge factor in the balance of power, the relative power between China and the rest of us. So I think it's an issue that comes to developing standards. It's an issue critically that has to do with data privacy and the ability to share data across the Atlantic. If we fail and do that, we're in real trouble. So I think that's one of the big things. If I can turn to Leah's two other points very briefly, China and Africa, Leah, you spoke about that. And I think that's very important. And I think it's in part a failure of European policy and giving too much space to China. So I think we can complain all day long about Chinese policy, but I think we have to do better ourselves. And you also mentioned climate, and on climate, I would say there's various things going on here. We have the Biden administration coming in saying they want to return to the Paris Agreement. We have the Green New Deal in Europe, and we have the Chinese working on a 5-year plan, as I understand it. So I think possibly that's an area where we can actually come together and agree, which is not to say that it will be easy, but so much for me.
Thank you very much indeed. I was wondering if I could perhaps call on Tom Malinowski. You've been looking at many of these areas as well, clearly, and you've introduced the session, as we know, but I was wondering whether you had any questions for our panel while you're here.
Sure. And let me start by relaying an experience that I had when I was in the U.S. State Department as Assistant Secretary for Human Rights under the last administration. I think it was 2015, and we got up the courage, so to speak, to try to do something multilaterally within the United Nations on human rights in China. And it had been a long time since we had made any such effort. Obviously, China can block any resolution in the Security Council. The Human Rights Council has not mustered the will to say anything about China for over 20 years now. So what we decided to do is very, very modest. We wrote a statement, a piece of paper with words on it, condemning the Chinese government for its crackdown on lawyers, which was at a terrible stage in China at that point, and also specifically calling them out for the extraterritorial application of some of their repressive measures. They had kidnapped several people in Hong Kong, I believe a book editor, a journalist. I think there were a couple of people who were joint Canadian or European, Swedish citizens at the time, if I recall correctly. And so I drafted this thing, and we got about a dozen like-minded countries, mostly European countries, in Geneva to sign on to this piece of paper. And so this is all it is. It's just words on paper. And yet the Chinese government went absolutely ballistic. Not so much because of the words, but because of the coordination. They were clearly profoundly worried that we had managed actually to do something together. And they responded by making very, very significant and specific threats against each of the countries, particularly the smaller countries that had signed on to the statement. And I have to say, in our State Department, my counterparts in the East Asia Bureau that Dr. Campbell used to lead concluded from that experience, so we should never do that again because it made them very, very cross. And we certainly did not at that point feel a great eagerness from some of our European partners to have the courage even to put words on a piece of paper like that. Again, maybe unilaterally, but not multilaterally in a way that would upset China. So maybe a question for you, Dr. Campbell, because you alluded to this when you said we shouldn't underestimate the challenges. Number one, do you think that China would be as worried today as they were in 2015-16 if we managed a more coordinated approach? Is that still something that would be as effective as it felt to me it was in 2015 in getting their attention? And number two, do you think we could withstand the inevitable, maybe pose this to you, Ambassador Ruga, as well, the inevitable response from China, which would be ferocious, particularly aimed at countries smaller than the United States and perhaps Germany as well, targeting our companies, perhaps holding business executives hostage, taking actual concrete steps to deter us from ever thinking about coordinated action again?
Thank you, Tom. Those are extremely good questions and hard questions. I think what we have seen over the course of the last several years is China's willingness to use economic tools in a coercive manner assertively against countries that even take modest steps to confront them. We've seen it play in Australia in a way that has upended Australian attitudes towards China. So we'll see that time. That plan. I want to.
Kurt, you're not coming across clearly for me. I'm not sure if others can hear you. I don't know if you're having
I think
connection.
I think that's for all of us.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I apologize.
I'm sorry, we're not.
Maybe while we on that, maybe Ambassador Ruga, would you be willing to?
Sure, I'll chip in my 5 cents. I'm sure Margaret McQuaig has plenty to say on this issue as well, but it seems to me, I don't know whether the Chinese are as sensitive as they used to be, but they certainly feel that they have the weight to throw around, and I think they're not shy about using it. But I think the tide has changed to some extent. There's more of a willingness for, let me talk about European governments in this case, to come out, or European members of parliaments or parliamentary committees to take a stance. Around about a month ago, our subcommittee on human rights in the Bundestag had a hearing with the Minister of Communications from Taiwan and 2 deputy ministers from Taiwan speaking. And you can be sure that Beijing was not enthusiastic about that kind of thing happening. So I think China's assertiveness and China's wolf warrior diplomacy has also created friction and pushback. But I think the challenge in international organizations is there. And the last point I would make is this: the United States, to some extent, withdrawing or lowering its profile in international organizations has, from a European point of view, been very counterproductive because, in line with the law of physics, this has created more space for China, and they have used it to best effect.
Thanks. Kurt, do we have you back?
That better?
Try again. No, I think you're still kind of frozen. I'm sorry.
Perhaps we can move on to one of the other questions that we've been looking at as we look at the way that we cooperate. One of the areas that China has been so successful in dominating over the last few years is the international organizations that we created together in the 1940s and 50s. China, of course, being one of the first, indeed the first signatory of the UN Declaration, and in recognizing the enormous sacrifice of the Chinese people in the Second World War. I wonder whether we can talk a little bit about how leadership of many of these UN agencies has gone from what we would traditionally describe as democratic countries, free countries, to countries that are either specifically China, where it's gone from 1 to 4, or countries where they are very strongly influenced by China. Now, Margaret, Canada's role in international organizations has always been incredibly important, and it's been one of the fundamental powers that has supported the UN system. I was wondering, how do you see this? How do you see free countries being able to work together to make sure that our values are not undermined by, for example, the International Telecoms Union, or indeed by the way that we've seen the World Health Organization behaving towards Taiwan?
Well, I think the WHO is a really excellent example of what you get when you get an organization that really is controlled by China. And so we will not have a full investigation into the origins of COVID. And what that means is that we may get it again or some variation. That's very, very dangerous and should be of concern to every nation around the world. And I think Australia deserves all the international support that it can get for stepping forward and saying that it's important to investigate that. The other thing that China does is it ensures that Taiwan is neutralized or kicked out of international organizations when it takes over leadership. And so you have that in WHO, where Taiwan should be a model of population health because they've gotten on top of COVID so well, and yet they are dealt out of most of the meetings. ICAO is another one where Taiwan is one of the big centers for international flights, and yet it's not a member of ICAO. So we need to look at ways of bringing Taiwan back in and of blocking China's ability to take that kind of action. You talk about Canada's role in international organizations, and this certainly is one of the things that we've been proudest of over the years, that we make international contributions. When you say that China tries to undermine countries getting together and doing things together, that's certainly what we've been seeing in the last 2 years in Canada, where we've been instructed to stop getting countries to speak out on behalf of our detainees. So we know that China doesn't like it because they've instructed us to stop. They've also instructed us to stop talking about rule of law. And they've said Canada is not a middle power, Canada is a small power, and we have to stop leaning towards the US. So this is what you get when China feels that it can bring all the actions of trade sanctions and detaining your citizens against you to put pressure on you. So my conclusion from this is not that it's going to be impossible for countries to do this together. My conclusion is it's now more important than ever for countries to work together in groups like the D-10, like COMAX, to try to ensure that vaccines are available throughout the world, through the kind of intervention we had at the UN Human Rights Council about a month ago, where 39 countries together signed statements calling out China's action on human rights. So it's only together that we'll be able to effectively push back on China for these kinds of actions.
Thank you very much. Now, before we go on to brief videos from Representative Elliot Engel, who sadly couldn't be with us, or with Senator Jim Risch, who likewise sadly couldn't be with us today, I just wanted to say a very quick thank you to our two guests who've been fantastic, Leah and Mike, who both good friends, and so I'm very pleased that they're here today. There is an awful lot more that we can talk about, and so I'm just going to hand over to say a quick thank you to them, and for them to any feedback that they have before we move on.
I'm fine, and I thank you very much.
Thanks. Right, I will look. I'll move on. I'll move on because we're jumping around on the screen, and rather than getting seasick or Zoom sick, let's go on to see these videos from Elliot and from Jim, and thank you very much to our panel who've been absolutely fantastic. To Kurt and Margaret and Boris, you've been stars as always in explaining a very clear position of cooperation and thought. Right, over to the videos.
Thank you all for having me today. I want to thank the Atlantic Council for bringing together this group of legislators and thought leaders to examine this critical issue. It's essential that democracies around the world work together to find common solutions to today's challenges. Challenges like a global pandemic, how to build a more resilient global economy, climate change, and the subject of today's hearing, how to address the challenges of China and China's efforts to shape a global order in its favor. These are challenges too big and too pressing for the United States to deal with them on our own. That's why I'm so pleased that such a diverse group from the US, Europe, South and East Asia has come together to determine the contours of a common democratic strategy toward China. In my 3 decades on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I have worked to find bipartisan solutions to foreign policy challenges. This is because bipartisan solutions endure. Consensus like that takes work, communication, and time. Finding a way forward that each of our countries can support, even on an issue where we share common cause, is worth that kind of investment. Thank you for making that kind of investment today, and I look forward to the outcomes of this conversation in the days to come.
Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. It's an honor to join with fellow legislators to discuss the challenges posed by China. I wish we could all meet in person as we've done in the past, but as we all know, these are very different times, and I think we all look forward to the time when we can get together personally. The United States rightfully calls China a strategic competitor. The European Union has labeled it a systemic rival. Whatever words we choose, the growing message is clear. China challenges the values and interests that our democracies have advanced for decades and longer to foster security and prosperity for billions of people. China attempts to undermine democratic societies and international organizations through malign influence, anti-competitive economic policies, increasingly aggressive military posture, and the coercion of its neighbors. This challenge is going to require a shared and sustained commitment over the long term. The United States, our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific and Europe, and other democracies around the world must commit to prioritizing China as a major consideration in our foreign and economic policies. Perhaps more importantly, we have to commit to each other that partnering with and supporting one another, we will do better. Lawmakers must play a role in both bringing these issues to the forefront and tackling them together. Fortunately, we already have a strong track record in that regard. The United States Congress came together, which is not an easy feat these days, to pass important legislation on investment screening, export controls, and China's human rights abuses. Parliaments in Europe are very active on everything from 5G security to human rights issues to Taiwan. In the Indo-Pacific, Australia has led the way for the rest of the world on foreign interference legislation. As we all know, there's a lot more to do. Legislatures should pursue more dialogue, more cooperation, and more joint advancement of the right policies. This past year, I introduced a bill entitled the Strategic Act, a comprehensive approach to China with concrete policies in key areas of the competition. We received a lot of good input on that bill. One of the reasons is it was shopped. It's not Republican, Democrat. It's certainly a bipartisan effort to advance these interests forward. In every respect, from economics to technology to defense, this bill advocates for closer cooperation with allies and partners, especially in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Last month, I also published a report outlining a concrete agenda for the United States and Europe to cooperate on shared challenges related to China. Next year, and in the years to come, I look forward to working with my colleagues in Washington and U.S. allies and partners to turn the ideas I've put forward in this bill and the ideas of others into concrete action. We will only succeed if we stick together. I look forward to hearing the outcome of today's discussions. Thank you again for having me here today, and God bless all of you.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear those words from Chairman Engel and Chairman Risch. I think it's another reminder that for all the partisan divisions that we suffer from in the United States, there is maybe not 100% agreement, but certainly a great deal of common ground when it comes to our approach to China. I'm just going to close since we've, I think, just about reached the end of our session. I think I want to refer to something that Dr. Campbell said earlier on about the need for a little bit of humility from the United States. I certainly believe very strongly that we need to have an assertive foreign policy towards China and other challenges, but one that is based on a foundation of moral authority. And the United States has, in the last 4 years, sometimes spoken with moral clarity about these issues, but with perhaps less moral authority than we have enjoyed in past years. I think that's about to change. I think we may soon see a pretty unique marriage of moral clarity and moral authority with the incoming Biden administration, which I hope will also serve as a strong foundation for building the international coalition with our allies that is so obviously needed for an effective collective approach to the challenge that China poses. So I leave this conversation inspired and with a lot of hope and with new ideas about how to get us to that point, and look forward to more exchanges and concrete cooperation with my fellow parliamentarians from around the world in meeting this challenge. Back over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Tom. And look, what a pleasure it has been to share this jointly with you, and your clarity and leadership when you were in office and now in Congress on human rights has been inspiring. So I'm particularly honored to be with you today. I'm also delighted that you speak and others speak about US leadership in this area, because all of us know that the free world needs coordination, needs leadership, and the United States has been incredibly important to all of your allies for many, many years. Now, we look forward very much to that US leadership continuing, but that doesn't mean that we don't have responsibilities. And I have to say, hearing from Boris Rüger and Margaret McQuaid was fantastic as well, because along with Leah and others in European parliaments, many of us recognize that this is a responsibility we all share, standing up for the values that built peace and prosperity around the world, that made British and many other people around the world prosperous and happy over the last 70 years, was down to cooperation, down to hard work, and down to realizing when we face challenges, we face them together. So thank you very much to the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much to my fellow chairman, Tom. Thank you to all the panelists, and indeed, even to those who weren't here today, because their contribution to shaping this event has still been important. And mostly thank you to everybody who's been participating and watching. This is part of a series of discussions that we'll be hosting over coming months, and I hope even years, and I look forward to staying in touch after that. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.